I never thought I'd see him again. Not after everything, whispered Sola, her voice trembling as she held her children close. And yet, he's standing there, watching, knowing everything I've tried to hide. Hey everyone, I'm Selena from Heartwoven Tales, and I created this story because I wanted to explore what happens when love, sacrifice, and revenge collide in ways no one could ever expect. I'm curious, where are you listening to me from today? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because today, we're diving deep into a story of secrets, danger, and a father who would do the unthinkable for his children. Zoran Vane stopped at the edge of the forest and let the engine die, the sudden quiet pressing against his ears harder than gunfire ever had. The cabin sat ahead like a secret that didn't want to be found, half hidden by tall trees and rot-darkened branches, its windows unlit, its roof sagging under years of neglect. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Every step he took toward that place was measured, deliberate, rehearsed 100 times in his mind during sleepless nights. 3 years of waiting had taught him patience the hard way. Revenge, he believed, tasted better when it was cold, precise, and undeniable. He checked the obsidian blade at his side, its surface swallowing light instead of reflecting it. It wasn't sentimental. He could have used a gun, could have ended things from a distance, but distance had been the problem from the start. He wanted to look at her. He wanted to see guilt on her face, to hear the truth crack under pressure, to end the question that had been rotting inside him since the day she disappeared. His mind replayed the numbers again, the way it always did when doubt tried to creep in. Months, dates, the exact span between the last night she swore she loved him and the day the pregnancy rumors reached his ears. The math never changed. The answer never softened. She had betrayed him. That certainty was the only thing that had kept him upright all these years. The path to the cabin crunched under his boots, the sound loud in the stillness, but nothing moved. No lights flicked on. No footsteps rushed to meet him. He paused once more, scanning the trees, trusting instinct more than sight. If she was smart, she'd have run. If she was stupid, she'd be inside, waiting, pretending this life of hiding was enough. Either way, tonight ended it. He reached the door, tested it once with his hand, felt the old wood tremble, then kicked it open without warning. The door slammed against the wall with a sharp crack, echoing through the cabin and out into the forest, but no scream followed, no gasp, no frantic movement. Zoran stepped inside, blade already in his hand, his body coiled for violence, eyes cutting through the dim interior. The room was small, almost humble, nothing like the dramatic hideouts he'd imagined during his long nights of planning. A wooden table, a few shelves lined with books whose spines were faded and worn, a kettle resting cold on a stove that hadn't been used recently. The place smelled wrong. Not fear, not sweat. Lavender, faint but unmistakable, mixed with the dry scent of old paper. He took another step, then stopped. The sound reached him slowly, quietly, like something his brain refused to accept at first. Breathing, soft, even, the kind that came from deep sleep, untouched by danger. His gaze dropped to the floor, to the wolfskin rug laid out near the hearth, and that's when he saw them. 2 small bodies curled close together, bare feet peeking from beneath a shared blanket, chests rising and falling in perfect unconscious rhythm. Toddlers. Not infants, not newborns. Old enough to sleep without fear, old enough to trust the world enough to close their eyes in it. Zoran didn't move. For the first time in years, his body hesitated without permission. His grip on the blade tightened, muscles locking as his eyes traced the shape of the children's faces, sharp and searching, hunting for something familiar and finding nothing he could name. One had darker hair falling messily across his forehead, a small fist curled near his mouth. The other lay on her side, lashes resting against her cheeks, lips parted slightly as she breathed. They looked warm, safe, alive in a way that didn't belong in the same room as him. His jaw clenched. This wasn't part of the plan. There was supposed to be shouting, pleading, maybe tears. There was supposed to be a woman who knew what she'd done and had nowhere left to hide. Instead, there was this quiet, fragile scene that felt like it had been stolen from someone else's life. He took a slow step forward, boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor, eyes never leaving the children. His mind searched desperately for logic, for explanation, for a way to fit this into the clean, brutal equation he'd lived by for 3 years. "How old are you?" he muttered under his breath, though he knew they couldn't answer. His eyes flicked to the walls, to the calendar pinned crookedly near the door, its pages months out of date. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with something sharper, more dangerous: doubt. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to their level, the obsidian blade still hanging from his hand like an accusation. He told himself not to care. He told himself children were irrelevant, collateral in a world that never played fair. But his body didn't listen. His breathing slowed, his movements softened without his consent. The boy shifted in his sleep, letting out a small sound, and Zoran froze again, instinct screaming at him to disappear, to become shadow. The child didn't wake. Neither did the girl. They slept on, unaware of the man standing over them, unaware of the violence he carried with him like a second skin. Zoran scanned their faces again, more carefully this time, searching for proof of another man, another bloodline, another reason to justify what he'd come here to do. He found nothing that satisfied him, only questions. A floorboard creaked somewhere deeper in the cabin. His head snapped up instantly, blade rising, eyes narrowing toward the sound. His heartbeat, steady until now, kicked harder against his ribs. Someone was here. Someone had seen him. The children slept on, fragile and defenseless, as Zoran shifted his weight silently, positioning himself between them and the dark hallway beyond. Whatever waited in that shadowed space, the night was no longer following his calculations. And for the first time, Zoran Vane didn't know what his next move would be. The floorboard creaked again, sharper this time, closer, and Zoran didn't turn his head immediately. His body stayed angled toward the children, instinct split in 2 directions, one trained by years of bloodshed, the other caught in something dangerously unfamiliar. He lowered himself further, slow and careful, until he was close enough to see the faint rise and fall of their chests. The boy's hand slipped free from the blanket as he shifted in his sleep, fingers curling inward as if holding on to something only he could feel. Moonlight slid through the cracked window at just the right angle, pale and cold, brushing over that small, clenched fist. Zoran's eyes narrowed without him meaning to. There was a mark there. At first glance it looked like a shadow, maybe dirt, maybe an old bruise, but the longer he stared, the clearer it became. The shape wasn't random. It wasn't blurred. It was sharp, deliberate, carved into skin as if nature itself had signed its name. His breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered, the word rough, almost angry, like he could argue with reality if he said it firmly enough. The mark sat at the center of the boy's palm, faint but unmistakable, a jagged crimson V, angled and broken in the exact way Zoran had seen only once before in his life, on his own skin, decades ago, when his father had held his hand under a harsh white light and told him what it meant. The mark of the ancestors, the seal that didn't lie, the bloodline signature that couldn't be forged, bought, or surgically altered. It appeared only once every 100 years, only in the firstborn of the Vane line, and only in those whose blood carried the full weight of the name. Zoran's heart slammed hard enough to hurt. His hand tightened around the obsidian blade, not in anger now, but in shock, knuckles whitening as his mind tried to tear itself away from what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't possible. He had already proven it. He had run the numbers 1,000 times, chased every detail until there was nothing left but certainty. Sola had been pregnant when she left. The timeline didn't match. The math never lied. That belief had been the foundation of everything he'd done since, yet the mark was there, quiet and undeniable. The boy shifted again, letting out a soft sound, and Zoran flinched, afraid he might wake him. His gaze moved slowly, reluctantly toward the girl. She lay still, one arm tucked beneath her head, hair spilling across her neck. Zoran leaned closer, close enough to smell the faint soap in her hair, close enough to see the gentle curve of her shoulder. The blanket had slipped just enough to expose the back of her neck. There it was, smaller but identical, the same jagged V, etched faintly into her skin, catching the moonlight as if it recognized him. Zoran felt something tear loose inside his chest, something old and buried that he'd kept locked away behind logic and rage. His mind reeled, scrambling for explanations that didn't exist. Twins, both marked. That alone broke the rules. The seal didn't repeat. It didn't mirror itself. It appeared once, singular and rare, and yet here it was twice, staring back at him in the most impossible place imaginable. "This can't be real," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice sounded strange in the quiet cabin, too loud, too alive. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out thought, replacing it with fragments of memory. His father's voice. Old family records, stories whispered during closed-door meetings about bloodlines and legacy and the curse of ambition. He remembered being told that the seal answered only to truth, that it had appeared during wars, during betrayals, during moments when the family stood on the edge of extinction. He remembered being told that if he ever saw it again, it would mean something had gone terribly wrong or terribly right. Zoran pulled his hand back as if the marks might burn him. His certainty cracked, not all at once, but in sharp, painful fractures. If these children carried the seal, then the foundation of his hatred was wrong. Not bent, not miscalculated, wrong. And that meant everything he'd built on it, every order given, every mile driven to reach this cabin, every intention he'd walked in with, was standing on a lie. His jaw tightened as anger surged back, hot and desperate, searching for a new target. If he wasn't the father, then how had this happened? If Sola hadn't betrayed him, then who had made him believe she did? The questions stacked on top of each other, heavy and relentless, and for the first time in years, Zoran felt outmatched by his own thoughts. A faint sound came from behind him, softer than the creaking floorboard, more controlled. The quiet scrape of fabric, the steady, careful breath of someone who had been awake for a long time. Zoran straightened slowly, every muscle in his body tightening as he turned toward the kitchen. The candlelight appeared first, a small trembling glow cutting through the darkness, followed by the outline of a woman standing just beyond the doorway. Sola stepped forward into the light. She looked thinner than he remembered, sharper around the edges, like life had carved pieces out of her and never bothered to put them back. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands slipping free around her face, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that no candle could hide. But when she met his gaze, there was no fear in it, only exhaustion and something steadier beneath it. Resolve. "You're finally here," she said quietly. Zoran didn't answer. His eyes flicked between her and the children, then back to her again, searching for deception, for guilt, for anything that matched the woman he'd been hunting in his head for 3 years. He found none of it. She held the candle with a steady hand, flame trembling only when a draft slipped through the cabin, her posture tense but unbroken. "You shouldn't be standing over them like that," she added, her voice low, careful, like she was speaking to a loaded weapon instead of a man. "If you're going to kill me, do it away from them." The words hit harder than any accusation ever had. Zoran felt the blade in his hand again, suddenly too heavy, too real. He took a step back without meaning to, his eyes dropping once more to the faint glow of the marks on the children's skin. "Explain," he said, his voice rough, stripped of authority and sharpened by something dangerously close to panic. Explain what I'm seeing. Sola didn't move closer. She didn't move away either. She simply watched him, eyes flicking briefly to the children before returning to his face. I told you once, she said. You didn't believe me then. Zoran's grip tightened, not in threat now, but in restraint. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, charged with truths pressing to be spoken. Outside, the wind picked up, branches scraping against the cabin walls like impatient fingers. Inside, 2 children slept on, marked by a legacy neither of them understood, while the man who had come to end a story stood frozen at its beginning. And for the first time since the night Sola vanished, Zoran Vane was no longer sure who the real enemy was, or how much time he had left before the truth demanded blood. Zoran stood where he was, the obsidian blade no longer raised but still hanging from his hand, as if his fingers had forgotten how to release it, his body locked between instinct and disbelief. Sola didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't step back the way fear usually forced people to do when they stood this close to him. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, the way someone looks when they've already accepted the worst outcome and decided that truth mattered more than survival. The candlelight revealed every mark life had left on her, the faint hollows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders stayed squared even though exhaustion pressed down on her like a weight she'd been carrying for years. You didn't come here to listen, she said calmly, her voice low so it wouldn't reach the children. You came here to end something. But before you do, you need to understand what you were ending. Zoran's jaw tightened as if he wanted to interrupt, but he didn't. Something in her tone stopped him. Not fear, not accusation, certainty. She told him about the beginning without drama, without trying to soften it for him, because she knew softness wouldn't survive a man like Zoran Vane. She talked about his brother arriving that night, how normal it had seemed at first, how he had smiled and spoken about business and family like nothing was wrong. She described the wine, the way it tasted slightly bitter but not enough to raise alarms, how she'd assumed it was cheap or old. She explained how the room had started to tilt, how sounds had slowed and stretched, how her own thoughts had felt like they were slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on to them. I didn't pass out, she said, meeting Zoran's eyes directly. That's the important part. I was awake. I remember standing. I remember talking. I remember things that felt real enough to destroy everything. Her fingers pressed into the table as she spoke, not shaking, just firm, as if anchoring herself to something solid while the memory threatened to drag her under again. She told him how the drug worked, not as a scientist, but as someone who had lived inside its effects, how it didn't erase reality but layered lies over it, how it turned suggestion into memory and doubt into certainty. She told him how, days later, when Zoran confronted her, she could see in his eyes that he was no longer listening to her words, only measuring how convincingly she denied what he already believed. You weren't asking me if I betrayed you, she said quietly. You were asking how long I planned to lie. Zoran felt his throat tighten because he remembered that conversation, remembered how calm he'd been, how sure, how righteous his anger had felt. He remembered walking away convinced he had taken the high road by not killing her then. The realization burned now. Sola continued, explaining how she discovered she was pregnant, how fear had replaced confusion the moment she understood what that meant inside a family where bloodlines were currency and heirs were leverage. She told him how she tried to reach him again, how every call failed, every message vanished, how his brother appeared once more, not threatening her directly but warning her with just enough truth to make the danger unmistakable. He told me you wouldn't listen, she said. He told me that if I stayed, my children wouldn't survive long enough to be born, and I believed him, because by then, you already didn't. She described leaving in the middle of the night, carrying nothing but essentials, moving through towns where names didn't matter, where no one asked questions because everyone was hiding from something. She spoke about poverty not as suffering, but as a constant narrowing of choices, about trading comfort for safety, about raising children in silence while teaching herself how to disappear. Zoran felt the blade slip from his fingers before he realized he'd let go. It hit the floor with a heavy, final sound that echoed through the cabin like a verdict. He stared at it as if it belonged to someone else, as if it hadn't been an extension of his will for most of his life. "I hunted you," he said, the words scraping out of him, raw and ugly. "I sent men. I told myself you deserved it." Sola nodded once, her face tightening for the first time, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. "I know," she replied. "I heard them sometimes. I hid deeper. I learned which nights to stay awake. I learned how to keep my children quiet when footsteps passed too close to the door." The way she said it made his chest ache in a way pain never had before. This wasn't accusation. This was consequence. The cabin seemed to shrink around them as the truth settled, the air thick with everything that had been lost because one man wanted a throne badly enough to poison his own blood. Zoran's mind raced, connecting things he had ignored for years, his brother's calm guidance, the subtle pushes toward anger, the way every path had led exactly where it benefited him most. Rage flared, but it had nowhere clean to land. It tangled with guilt, with regret, with the unbearable knowledge that he had been used like a weapon against the people he cared about most. He opened his mouth to speak again, to demand more, to ask how deep the betrayal went. But before the words could form, a sharp crack sounded outside, distinct and deliberate, followed by another, closer, answering it like a signal. Sola moved instantly, her body turning toward the children, her hand pulling the blanket higher over them without hesitation, without panic. Zoran crossed to the window, every instinct snapping back into place as his eyes scanned the tree line and caught movement where shadows didn't belong. He recognized the spacing, the patience, the methodical way they circled without revealing themselves. "They followed me," he said quietly, the realization cutting deeper than the threat itself. Outside, branches snapped again, closer now, boots pressing into soil with careful weight, the perimeter tightening while the cabin sat exposed and small in the middle of it all. Zoran reached for his weapon, his mind racing not with revenge now, but with the terrifying understanding that the lie which destroyed his family had finally come to collect what it was owed. And this time, there would be no running from the consequences. The sounds outside grew closer, no longer careless snaps of branches, but deliberate movement, boots placed with trained patience, men who knew how to surround a target without announcing themselves. Zoran stepped back from the window slowly, his mind cutting through panic and rage until only one brutal truth remained, clear and unavoidable. If he stayed inside that cabin, if he fought from those walls, if he survived as Zoran Vane, the children sleeping on the floor would never truly be safe. Not tonight, not next year, not ever. His name alone was a bounty, his bloodline a prize men would kill for without hesitation, and no amount of firepower or loyalty could change that. He looked at Sola, who was kneeling beside the children now, her hand resting lightly on their backs, as if her touch alone could keep the world from breaking in. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything they had never said over 3 years of silence passed between them without words. "Take them to the cellar," he said quietly, not as an order, but as a request that carried finality. "No matter what you hear, don't come out." Sola searched his face, sensing the shift, understanding that this wasn't another plan built on survival, but something far more dangerous. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight, controlled, already bracing for an answer she wouldn't like. Zoran didn't reply immediately. He crouched briefly beside the children, close enough to see the faint rise and fall of their breathing, close enough to let the truth settle fully into his bones. "I'm going to make sure they stop looking," he said at last. He straightened, rolled his shoulders once, and stepped toward the door, every movement deliberate, stripped of hesitation. When he pushed the door open and walked into the yard, he didn't do it like a hunted man slipping away into darkness. He did it openly, loudly, letting gravel crunch beneath his boots, letting his silhouette stand clear against the dim forest light. The mercenaries froze for a fraction of a second when they saw him, recognition cutting through their formation like a blade. "Zoran Vane," one of them muttered into a communicator, the name carrying weight even now. Zoran didn't wait for them to finish their confirmation. He moved toward his armored vehicle parked near the tree line, not running, not hiding, his presence daring them to follow. Gunfire cracked through the air, shots tearing into the dirt behind him, splintering bark, but he kept moving, every step dragging their focus away from the cabin, away from the life he was trying to erase himself for. He reached the vehicle and climbed inside, the heavy door sealing with a familiar thud that had once made him feel invincible. Inside, the dashboard lights glowed softly, steady and calm, mocking the chaos outside. His men's voices crackled over the encrypted channel, confusion bleeding through their disciplined tones. "Boss, pull back," one of them urged. "We can extract you." Zoran stared through the windshield at the narrow path leading toward the cliffs beyond the forest, his jaw set. "No extraction," he said evenly. "This ends here." He reached beneath the console and keyed in a sequence he had memorized years ago, a protocol never meant to be used while the vehicle was occupied. Warnings flashed across the screen, red and insistent, but he ignored them. Outside, the mercenaries were closing in, thinking they were cornering a king, unaware they were witnessing a man dismantle himself piece by piece. The explosion tore through the forest like a scream, fire blooming outward, swallowing metal, earth, and identity in a violent rush of heat and sound. The shockwave rolled through the trees, shattering windows, knocking men off their feet, sending a column of black smoke clawing into the sky. From a distance, it looked final, unmistakable, the kind of destruction no one survived. Inside the cabin, Sola covered the children instinctively, her body curling around them as the blast thundered through the ground beneath her, her heart hammering as silence followed. Outside, the mercenaries stared at the burning wreckage in stunned disbelief, their mission collapsing in an instant. There would be no body to confirm, no voice to answer the radio, only fire and twisted steel where Zoran Vane had stood moments before. But death wasn't what Zoran chose. Pain was. The fire scarred him deeply, searing skin, burning away fingerprints, destroying the face the world recognized, rewriting him in agony and smoke. He crawled from the wreckage broken and unrecognizable, every nerve screaming, every breath a battle, but alive enough to finish what he had started. By the time the flames died down and the mercenaries regrouped, there was nothing left to find, no man to chase, no king to fear. News spread quickly through the underworld by morning, whispers turning into certainty as accounts froze, alliances shattered, and the Vane syndicate collapsed inward, on itself without its center. The great dawn was dead. His empire dissolved into chaos, stripped of direction and money, men turning on each other in the vacuum he left behind. In the forest, all that remained was ash and silence. The name Zoran Vane burned into the ground and erased by the same fire. He had traded power for anonymity, control for absence, choosing to become nothing so his children could become anything. And as dawn crept slowly over the trees, painting the smoke-stained sky in pale light, one final truth lingered beneath the devastation, quiet and unresolved. Zoran Vane was gone. But whether the ghost he had created could endure what came next was a question the fire hadn't answered yet. 6 months had passed since the fire. 6 months since Zoran had erased himself from the world. 6 months since the name Zoran Vane became nothing more than whispers and rumors among the remnants of the syndicate. The coastal town where Sola had taken the children was small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet no one noticed the quiet figure who had arrived almost simultaneously with their new beginning. He was not the man they had once known. He was smaller in stature, shoulders hunched from years of burden, a scar running across his cheek that caught the morning sun in a dull, angry glint. He never spoke to anyone, never volunteered information, and never allowed his face to be seen. A heavy hood and a tattered mask concealed his features, but his eyes, when glimpsed, were sharp, calculating, and impossibly alive. He moved with purpose, but quietly, like a shadow cast long and low over the pier, blending into the creaking boards and the salt-scented wind, always watching, always present, though no one knew it. At first, Sola noticed nothing of him. The cottage was small and humble, its whitewashed walls and simple garden a refuge for her and the twins, Caspian and Vesper, who had grown robust in those months despite the hardships of their hidden life. She was a teacher in the town now, quiet and unobtrusive, but her vigilance never faltered. Strange incidents began happening. Small thugs, men from other towns, would appear near the school or around her home, testing, probing. Each time, they disappeared overnight, leaving behind no trace, only the unnerving feeling that someone unseen was watching, waiting, a silent hand moving through the shadows. At first, Sola attributed it to luck, to coincidence, until one evening she saw the figure standing atop the pier as the sun dipped low, the tide glinting beneath him, hooded and silent, watching the children play. Her heart had skipped, recognizing the familiar posture, the way his presence commanded attention, even without movement, and a chill had run through her spine. It was him. She didn't know how she knew. She didn't speak. She only watched as he disappeared into the fog of the harbor. The man's life had changed completely. Zoran no longer had wealth, no status, no empire to command. Every cent he once held had been moved into a trust for Caspian and Vesper, secured in a way that no one, not even his brother, could touch. The Vane fortune was gone to the world, but in the hands of the children, it remained untouched and inviolable. Zoran had stripped himself of everything he had ever fought to preserve, choosing instead to live in anonymity, to become something lesser in the eyes of men so that those he loved could live larger, freer, safer. He slept in the open air when necessary, worked the docks for small pay, carried heavy loads from dawn to dusk, and ate whatever he could scavenge or purchase with the meager wages he earned. His hands bore the calluses of honest labor, a life he had never known and never wanted, but one he accepted without complaint because it meant safety for the children. He had traded comfort and kingship for vulnerability and survival, a paradox he carried without complaint, moving through each day like a ghost among humans, unseen, unclaimed, yet ever present. Each morning, he would watch from the shadows as Vesper and Caspian played by the water's edge, laughing freely, unburdened by names, empires, or legacy. He would ensure the swings were safe, the sand was free of sharp shells, that no stranger came too close, and that the tide never reached where the children ran. If anyone attempted to intimidate or harm the small family, Zoran intervened swiftly, silently, leaving only whispers behind. A snapped fishing line where a man had tried to sneak past, an empty locker when a bully approached the schoolyard, the heavy sense of being watched that made predators rethink their choices. No one ever saw him clearly. No one understood the cost, and no one questioned the absence of violence that should have been inevitable given his reputation. In this way, he became more than man. He became a legend, whispered among those who tested the town, a phantom who would strike if necessary, yet never claimed credit, never sought recognition. Sola sometimes glimpsed him from the kitchen window, tall, silent, hooded, leaning against the pier railing as though the wind itself had taken human form. She noticed the way he would follow the children from a distance during walks, keeping them in line with his presence alone. He didn't speak to her, he didn't intrude, but she felt it. The protection, tangible and heavy, a constant weight pressing down on her shoulders and settling into a place of fragile comfort. Every time she saw him, she recognized the same body language, the same quiet power that had once ruled cities with fear, command, and precision. But here, now, it was different. It was devoted. It was love expressed in silence, in sacrifice, in a life willingly stripped to the bone. Zoran's brother, meanwhile, had discovered the truth too late. He had attempted to claim the Vane fortune, only to be met with legal barriers so meticulously constructed that the effort was futile. Every account had been moved, every document sealed, every potential loophole closed. The children had become untouchable, not through strength or firepower, but through strategy, foresight, and Zoran's willingness to destroy everything he had built for the sake of their future. The man who had once commanded empires now slept on the sand when storms hit, worked until his muscles burned, and lived in quiet anonymity. And yet, despite the physical toll, despite the hunger, despite the cold, there was an unshakable satisfaction that ran deeper than any wealth or power could offer, the knowledge that Caspian and Vesper were alive, free, and growing in a world where men could no longer manipulate them with greed, deceit, or violence. Even at night, when the town slept and the children dreamed in safety, Zoran patrolled the edges, moving silently along the cliffs and waterfront, ensuring that no danger reached the small cottage. His body bore every scar and bruise, each a reminder of his former life, each a token of the sacrifices he had made. Yet his spirit remained unbroken, steadfast, and relentless. He watched the ocean tides shift, calculating the safest paths, anticipating storms, mapping shadows. He became a man who no one could see, yet who saw everything, and every instinct, every fiber of his being, revolved around one immutable purpose: to protect the children he had once failed to recognize as his own in time, to guard them against the consequences of the past he had chosen to erase from the world. Even the townspeople whispered of him, though none had met him. A hulking laborer who worked silently, who never ate at the cafes, who never spoke, who seemed to vanish into fog at dusk. Those who tried to cross the widowed teacher or her family reported odd, unsettling encounters, shadows that moved with impossible speed, flickers of motion in peripheral vision, doors that opened and closed without touch, a presence that made them second-guess every step. The message was clear even if the delivery remained unseen. These children were protected, untouchable, watched over by a ghostly figure whose identity no one dared guess. Zoran Vane had become a lion who pulled his own teeth, a predator who chose humility to defend innocence, a man willing to live as nothing so that everything his children valued could remain untouched. And though he slept little, ate sparingly, and never rested fully, he moved through the town each day with a singular resolve. The past had died in fire, his empire was gone, and only one truth mattered: the lives of the children he had once been blind enough to almost destroy. Years had passed, but time in the small coastal town moved with a pace that seemed slower than the world beyond the cliffs. The salty wind carried the cries of gulls, the faint rhythm of waves hitting the shore, and the distant hum of boats returning to the harbor. But nothing disturbed the peace of the small, whitewashed cottage where Sola and the twins had made a life far removed from the chaos of the Vane name. Caspian and Vesper were now 10 years old, inseparable in their daily routines, their laughter ringing out like sunlight across the sand as they raced along the beach, collecting shells, building castles and pretending the tide was a dragon they had to keep at bay. They did not know the man who watched over them from the shadows each week, leaving fresh loaves of bread, carved wooden toys, small treats or repairs to broken fences and swings. He never came close enough to be seen, never spoke a word, and yet his presence was felt in the safety that surrounded them. To the townspeople, he was the silent watcher, a figure whose existence seemed more legend than reality, whispered about with awe, respect, and a tinge of fear, a protector whose eyes were everywhere even when no one saw them. Sola stood on the porch that morning, watching the twins chase one another along the shoreline. Her hands rested lightly on the railing, knuckles white from the quiet tension she carried for years, tension that had softened but never fully left her. Her eyes were trained to the tree line beyond the open fields, scanning for movement she knew she could trust, without fully understanding why she could trust it. And there he was, standing tall and still, his figure familiar even after so many months, his scarred face hidden beneath a hood, posture rigid yet relaxed, the weight of years of sacrifice and vigilance built into the lines of his body. Her breath caught, a mix of relief, sorrow, and something unspoken stirring in her chest. She did not call to him. She did not wave. She merely watched him, knowing he was there, knowing he had never left, knowing he had silently endured everything to allow her and the children to exist without fear. Their eyes met across the distance for a fleeting moment, a shared acknowledgement that contained decades of pain, longing, and the unyielding bond of blood and love that could never be erased. The twins ran back toward the cottage, squealing, faces flushed from the wind and sun, oblivious to the presence of the man who would have given his life without hesitation to protect them. Caspian's hand brushed against the carved toy left at their doorstep the night before, Vesper's small fingers tracing the fresh patterns cut into the wood, both unaware of the guardian who had made these gifts in his quiet solitude. Sola followed them inside, her movements automatic, but her mind remained on the figure she had glimpsed at the tree line. She knew his life had changed completely. He no longer commanded empires, no longer had soldiers, no longer wielded fear as a weapon. Yet he remained more formidable than any man in the town, because he had surrendered everything he had for the safety and freedom of those he loved. In his absence from their lives, he'd become more than a man. He had become a principle, a force quietly shaping their world, the unseen architect of their safety, the keeper of their future. That afternoon, the sun dipped low, turning the sky to shades of violet and gold, a perfect backdrop to the small celebrations Sola had arranged for the children. Simple candles on a homemade cake, a few friends from the town invited under careful discretion, laughter spilling into the air with no sense of urgency, no hint of the violence that had once stalked them. And yet Zoran remained nearby, a shadow along the cliffs, watching, analyzing every potential threat, anticipating every unseen danger, ready to intervene without hesitation, yet careful to maintain distance. He had long abandoned personal comfort. The sand he slept on, the boards he carried, the small meals he made from meager rations, all were a part of his continued penance and devotion. He had traded every piece of himself, every indulgence, every claim to power and wealth for a quiet life that allowed the children to run freely, to grow, to laugh, to learn without knowing the weight of the world he had once carried for them. His presence went unnoticed by all but Sola, and even she could only glimpse him in fragments. The subtle movement at the edge of the cliff, a shadow passing among the rocks, the glint of the sun on a hidden scar, the faint echo of boots on the sand in early morning, and in every gesture, every movement, was the certainty of protection. He had calculated risk, studied patrols, monitored the tides and the winds, memorized the town's patterns, learned every route, every alley, every potential path of danger, ensuring that the children could live and grow, untouched by the dangers he had once ruled with violence. This was no longer the life of a Don. It was the life of a man who had loved so completely that he had erased himself, erased his identity, erased everything he had been to become something greater for the sake of those who could never understand the full scope of his sacrifice. Even when storms came, or when the wind carried the scent of strangers to the cottage, Zoran was there. He moved silently along the cliffs, along the forest line, along the water's edge, unseen but present, intervening when necessary. Broken fences were mended before a child could stumble, threats were neutralized without a single witness, and any disturbance in the small town always ended without harm to those he protected. Sola could sense him sometimes, the feeling of calm that came after a storm, the inexplicable sense that nothing could reach them while he was near, but she never intruded on him, never called to him, never sought to reward him. She only watched, silently grateful, silently acknowledging that love had taken a form stronger than she could have imagined, not in presence, not in comfort, not in affection, but in invisible sacrifice and endless vigilance. The twins, blissfully unaware of his existence, celebrated each moment as children do, building memories that would last a lifetime, memories untainted by fear, memories created because a man who had once ruled with death and power had chosen to live without recognition, without glory, without claim, solely to ensure that the laughter continued. And when night fell, Zoran remained at his post, eyes scanning the horizon, hood drawn tight against the wind, body coiled, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the town as if the safety of the world rested on him alone. His presence was never claimed, never known, never named. Yet in every loaf of bread, every carved toy, every repaired swing, every shadow moving at the edges of sight, his legacy endured. Sola stood once more on the porch as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, the sky a brilliant mixture of violet, gold, and soft pinks. She saw him in the distance, perfectly still, a sentinel who had lived in silence for years and for the first time in a long time allowed herself a quiet smile, a nod of recognition, a heartbeat of understanding. They could never be together in the daylight, never share the life they might have had, never claim the moments that belonged to others. But they shared something deeper, the certainty that the children were safe, that love had prevailed, and that sacrifices unspoken had rewritten the meaning of family, legacy, and devotion. Zoran had spent decades building a kingdom of fear, but in the years since his death had been faked, in the absence of wealth, power, and notoriety, he had built something infinitely more enduring, a sanctuary of love, a fortress of protection, a life woven in silence to shield the innocent. He had done the unthinkable. He had conquered pride, ego, and desire for recognition to ensure that the future of his children was untouched by vengeance, ambition, or cruelty. And as the last light of day settled over the town and the twins' laughter carried softly on the wind, Zoran remained unseen, unclaimed, a hidden king whose legacy would never be written in history books, but whose love had shaped lives more profoundly than any empire ever could. Even if the world forgot him, even if his name became nothing more than rumor, the town, the cottage, and the children carried the echoes of his devotion, his sacrifice, and his watchful presence. The silent watcher remained eternal, a man who had died to himself in order to give life and freedom to those he loved. And in the quiet dusk, with the sky painted in those impossible shades of violet and gold, the story of Zoran Vane closed not with violence or vengeance, but with the triumph of love, the permanence of protection, and the unspoken knowledge that sometimes the greatest kings are those whose crowns are invisible, whose power is measured not in fear, but in the safety of those they guard. And that's the end of this intense journey, where love, sacrifice, and courage rewrote a father's legacy. If Zoran's choices gave you chills, or if Sola's strength touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me what moment shook you the most. Make sure you subscribe to Heartwoven Tales so you never miss a story that pulls you into a world of passion, suspense, and unthinkable choices. And remember, sometimes the strongest heroes are the ones who live in the shadows, protecting the people they love most.